Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk about Hyvä, and this time I'm not going to give a big introduction. What is Hyvä and everything? I'm assuming, hopefully, you're okay with that part of things because there's a lot to talk about, and this time I want to focus on this particular aspect, which is compatibility modules. So one of the nice, big, important aspects of Magento is its extensibility, right? And that we can customize anything. So one important part of Magento, of course, is then its front end. So if we build something for an extension, a module, and that somehow you customize the front end, usually it would be built for Luma. So how can these extensions then be used in combination with a store view that is running on Hyvä themes? Because Hyvä themes is a complete rebuild of the front-end stack. So the answer is compatibility modules. And the process of writing these compatibility modules is what I want to talk about today here. So basically, a compatibility module is an additional module that gets installed on top of the module that we want to make compatible, what I usually call the original module. So we have the original module and the compatibility module. And the original module would be for Luma, so it has PHTML files and less files and JavaScript files and HTML files for knockout remote templates and so on. But when making that compatible to Hyvä, basically all of these things, we just end up with only PHTML files. Of course, there also are images maybe, and images, they stay as they are, right? But in general, the idea is we replace all of those things with PHTML files. So, but of course, not all PHTML is the same, right? And in particular, one of the big differences between Hyvä and Luma-based templates is that in Hyvä, we generally use HTML5. So a lot of the nice things that that make website interesting and interactive and everything, back when Magento 2 was being built, JavaScript like jQuery had to be used to build these things. But nowadays, many of these things, we don't actually need JavaScript for them at all anymore. For example, we can use in a text input field, we can have a data set tag there with a lot of items, and it will automatically provide like a drop down with those items to select from. Plus we can also enter custom ones. So there are many capabilities in HTML5 that we can use without writing a single line of JavaScript. And of course that all makes everything much more lightweight and faster too, which is great. Now less, right from the beginning, less has been very controversial around Magento. So many people started alternative front ends right back in 2015 when Magento 2 was released, like SAS-based themes and so on. But they never really took off. I guess mainly because, well, Luma was the default. Everybody developed for Luma, and somehow less kind of, simply because it was there, kind of was the default, and people kind of begrudgingly started using it. So less is still around, right? Even though it's not a real good solution, to be honest. And less suffers from the same downsides that traditional CSS files suffer from. But more on that later. And then, of course, there are JavaScript module. And oh, one moment. This is actually like this from 2 slides. So less, and basically we don't use less at all in Hyvä. We just use Tailwind CSS utility classes. JavaScript, instead of using external JavaScript files, so without some kind of bundling in Luma, on a typical page request, there might be anywhere between 80 and 300 JavaScript files being loaded for a single page. But we avoid all of that in Hyvä. So generally, there's only a single JavaScript file being loaded, and that's Alpine Js, and everything else is in the page, embedded in the page. And the same is true for HTML files. So in Luma, we have these remote knockout templates.html files, and we also inline those and use Alpine Js to render them on demand. So there's no real benefit in using them as external files there, even if they're included in a bundle. yeah, it works great just inlining them too. And again, I'll work through, that's basically what I'm going to talk about next, right? I'll go over, okay, what does it mean converting JavaScript in this way? What does it mean to replace the styles, etc.? Okay, so step by step. This is written from the point of view of maybe an agency and they want to build a Hyvä store. And as part of that store, they want to use a module, right? So typically every store includes some kind of modules. So the first thing to do is to check the compatibility module tracker. So this module tracker is actually a GitLab page, issue tracker board basically. And here we have different columns. So we have a request column. Every licensee of Hyvä can create new issues here, and they don't have any specific label attached to them, so they're just here in this open tag, which basically means it's like a requested module. Okay, I would like it if this module were available. And then if people are able to vote on issues right here, and can be sorted by popularity. So this shows us which modules are requested a lot, right? So what modules are most important to them. So then we're able to say, okay, this seems to be like a really important thing, so we'll make it compatible ourselves. So then it gets the accepted tag. But of course, it's not our personal time as Hyvä is very limited. So most modules actually are made compatible by the agencies and the licensees themselves. And then when somebody starts working on them, if people tell me about it, I'll add the in progress label to it. So these are things that people are working on. So if you're interested in a module and it's being worked on, maybe you want to reach out to whoever's working on it, and maybe you can work together. Or because maybe somebody only needs a certain subset of features, and then only those features are being made compatible and not everything. And then you could talk to them and maybe split features, right? So just an idea. And once work has completed, then the publish tag gets added. So, then that module is there and can be used by anybody with a Hyvä license. So no additional work is required if the complete feature set that's required is covered. And then also there are some extensions or modules which just work. Maybe because they don't have any backend front-end aspect, only back-end aspects, or maybe, for some reason, no work is necessary, so it could just be used, and that's what this compatible tag is for. Right. So that's the whole idea of this compatibility module tracker. And that would be the good place to start. And if you're interested in a module and it's not in there, well, then please open an issue in the tracker. And maybe ask around in the Hyvä Slack if somebody else also is interested in working on it, or maybe already is working on it, because not everybody takes the time to open issues. Some people maybe just build compatibility modules without actually adding a ticket there. Okay, so let's assume there is no existing compatibility module. The next step to do then is to request a skeleton compatibility module repository. So this is a compatibility module. Well, let me just show you here. So let me see, somewhere here. Yeah, right here. So in this group, we have a ton of repositories in varying states. So if a repository is here, it doesn't mean it's completed, right? So these are just repositories for compatibility modules, which at one point will be ready. Okay, so and we can generate these skeleton repositories, and what we need to do that is we need the original module name, the Magento module name, and the composer package name of the original module. So then we run the little script, and then you get a new little compatibility module repository. And usually when somebody requests that, then I assign them, or somebody else from the Hyvä team assigns this person as maintainer. So you can work straight in that repository. You don't have to fork or anything. Just go ahead and clone it and start working with it and writing your compatibility module. So now, what does such a skeleton repo contain? It's not a lot. It's basically these few files here, right? So we have a composer JSON and stuff. Most interestingly, right, we have this di.xml here in the front-end area. So let's have a closer look what's in there. So in the composer JSON file, we we have a basic dependency on a module called Hyvä themes Magento-2 compat module fallback, and a dependency on the original module, right? So basically, the original module is required for this compat module to do anything. Right? It's like an additional layer. Now, more interestingly is this front-end di.xml configuration. In there, what happens is a constructor argument is built for the compat module registry class. And that's an array, and this array is basically a mapping from the original module, Magento name, to the compat module. But because technically it would be possible to cover one original module by multiple compatibility modules, maybe different features covered by different compatibility modules, or vice versa. One compatibility module could cover multiple original modules, so that's not a one-to-one mapping, it's an array of tuples, right? So we have just a list of compatibility modules. The question is, what does this do that we have this mapping, right? What is it good for? Well, it's just one thing at this time. It's automatic template overrides. So because all of the PHTML templates that exist in the original modules, all the front-end ones, that is, they have to be rewritten. Right? They will have to be somehow made compatible so they work in a Hyvä context. And of course we can replace templates without having some kind of registry here. But it's always a bit of overhead, right? We have to add the layout XML, we have to reference a specific block and assign a new template and so on. And that's no longer necessary. What we get here is we get automatic template overrides. So for example, there's a original module, Smile Elastic Suite. It's super popular. And part of that Smile Elastic Suite module group is a Smile Elastic Suite catalog. And in there we have a module, a template file, in view front-end templates layer view PHTML. So if I want to override this template file in a compat module, right? I might have my compat module here, and I now have two options where I want to place this file. And all I have to do is I need to create this file either in exactly the same location, so view front-end templates layer view, in the compat module, and it will be used automatically instead of the original module one. Or, and that's a special case, if a compatibility module covers multiple original modules, then we could also put it into a subdirectory within templates named after the original module, right? And then, that would also be used. So we just copy over the template and can start adjusting it without having to do any layout XML stuff. It just makes the whole workflow of creating these kind of compatibility modules easier, less work there. Okay, but that's just a small thing, so let's have a look what else is usually a good idea to do when building these modules. So first of all, it's a really good idea to have a Luma reference store side by side on the same instance. So I'll create a new store view, configure Luma as the content there, because then if I can always open a new browser tab with Luma, and there I can see how the module should be working, right? Hopefully. So there I can have a look, what does it actually do, and then on the other browser window I can see what's the current state in Hyvä, right? And that way it's easier to figure out what's going on, what's still needed, etc. So that's always very, very handy to have. Question is though, if I have both Hyvä and Luma store views side by side within one Magento instance, and I'm writing a module, how can I now only affect pages in Hyvä while the Luma pages are, they should remain unchanged? So that's a very common requirement, right? And if we're talking about anything related to the view, so blocks, view models, layout XML templates and such, in those cases we usually configure the view in layout XML. The problem is if we add something, let's say, to a default XML, then that would apply not only to the Hyvä theme, it would also apply to the Luma theme. So to work around this, if a Hyvä theme is active, an additional set of layout XML handles is applied to every page. So it's the normal set of handles, but also with a Hyvä underscore prefix. So let's say if we had a page and in Luma, and in there we have the layout handles default XML, customer address edit XML, customer account XML. Then in Hyvä we have the normal ones, but we also have Hyvä default, Hyvä customer address edit, Hyvä customer account, etc. So this allows us to configure layout changes that will only be applied to a Hyvä theme. So generally in compatibility modules, it's actually customary to only use the Hyvä prefixed versions of the layout handles because, well, the compatibility module should not affect any other store view, only Hyvä store views. But sometimes it's not enough to affect these changes in layout XML. For example, in observers or plugins, we might also need to take some action, but only on Hyvä themes. It's actually quite common that because many modules do these kind of things in PHP classes, like dynamically set templates and such. So in those cases, we might have to do some changes in PHP outside of the view layer. And for this purpose, there's a class, Hyvä theme service current theme. It just has a single method, is Hyvä. So we can inject that class and just check, is currently a Hyvä theme? If not, well, we don't do anything, right? So that's very straightforward. Okay, so that's a bit of basics. But what does it actually look like if I now want to make a module compatible? Well, usually I would install the module, the original module. I would install the skeleton compatibility module, right? And then I'll load the Hyvä page, and this is what I usually see. Uncaught reference error, require is not defined, right? Because Hyvä doesn't use require.js. So the alternative, if I don't see this, usually I don't see any errors, and that means the module is only using datamage init or xmagento init, which is simply ignored in Hyvä. So I either see nothing or I don't see require, but in either case I don't have a working website. So now I have to basically start work. And what I do is I first of all copy the template that is causing this require error or has these datamage init or xmagento init declarations in it. I copy it over into the compat module. And then I confirm that actually the copy is being used in my Hyvä theme instead of the original template. I'll just add a little, I am here tag, script or whatever in there so I can see, okay, it's using my template, and then I can start the work making it compatible. So, and that's actually two steps. First, rewriting the JavaScript, and then also rewriting the styles. And then I'll usually try the next template or next page that is somehow affected by the module, right? And I just go through step by step and rewrite all the JavaScript and the styles there. So what does it mean to rewrite the JavaScript? Well, the goal is, in effect, to inline all the require.js modules. Now, we have different options how we want to do this. We don't use require.js in Hyvä, we don't use knockout, we don't use jQuery, we don't use UI widget, we don't use underscore, we don't use any of the Magento JavaScript library modules that in the major namespace, none of that. Which means all the JavaScript of most modules doesn't work at all. So we have to choose how do we want to re-implement that or migrate, refactor that into Hyvä. And it's astonishing how wide, the amount of effort that is required to do that for a module varies greatly. So there actually were quite a few modules where the JavaScript continued to work because it already was vanilla JavaScript. All that was required was just using it in the page instead of in an external JavaScript file. So we could have just loaded it externally too if we were able to define require, right? So that's one option. Then we also have the option of using Alpine Js, and that's mostly useful if we have JavaScript that somehow interacts with the DOM, like input validations, interactivity, showing stuff, hiding stuff, those kind of things. Maybe some animations, stuff like that. So we have different options, and we want to choose the right tool when migrating the JavaScript. So first the question is, okay, where do I even start, right? In Magento, I would usually use either inline require call or maybe xMagento init or datamage init. So in Hyvä, if I use vanilla JavaScript, so here's one example. If I want to use some kind of tracking, for example, like here, right? There's some kind of campaign catcher from a compatibility module for MailChimp. All that's needed here is we want to take the existing JavaScript code, which happened to be pretty vanilla JavaScript anyway, if I remember correctly. And well, just to be safe, the page is loaded completely. We add an event listener before we executed anything here. And to keep the global scope tidy, I like adding these kind of functions into immediately executed function expression here, right? So but basically we just add an event listener and then we trigger whatever needs to be done in that function. So that would be the most simple vanilla JavaScript entry point into JavaScript. It's kind of comparable to if I have a xMagento init tag with a star selector, right? Then no DOM nodes are required. So that's a good use case here. The alternative, if I usually have a lot of interaction with some DOM nodes somewhere, that would be a prime candidate for Alpine Js. Now, Alpine Js is a super simple, lightweight JavaScript library. Super simple because it generally just takes an hour or two after reading the documentation, which is pretty terse, to feel quite at home. Yeah, I was surprised how simple it was. If somebody knows Vue.js, they'll be right at home. It's not exactly the same, but a lot of the syntax is very close. So it's really quite easy, and it's also super easy to mix it with vanilla JavaScript. So anyway, the idea is we have at the root of a Alpine Js component, we have an xData binding, so to speak, right, or attribute, and we can either specify a JavaScript object for any kind of state directly in there, or we call a method that returns an object. That's the most common case. And then we can specify event observers, like here we have an event for a subscriber for the event private content loaded, and we place it on the window element object instead of this div here. And then we specify which function should be called when this event is triggered. So for example, receive section data, and we pass in the event itself, which would then map to this function here on the view model of that component. Same for click or other events here, right? So it's pretty straightforward, and we can. It's actually very close also to Knockout.js in a way, and it's just better, better because it's faster. It kind of just works easier. I don't know. It's much more modern. So, but the concepts are similar. So somebody who's familiar with Knockout.js will also be very quick to be able to work with Alpine Js here. Okay, and finally we also have the case where there maybe is a lot of JavaScript code, maybe some SDK that was supplied by a third-party vendor. So these kind of external JavaScript files, maybe they're even obfuscated or minified or something, so it's not really easy to inline them, and maybe it's a good idea to keep them as external JavaScript files. That's usually the case if it's not something that's Magento specific, but something generic. So those we of course still can load as external JavaScript files. However, it's quite a problem in regards to Google Core Web Metrics. If we have a external JavaScript file, it always impacts how Google, page load speeds, time to interactive, etc. So we have to treat those with care. It's really important not just to add script tags for everything we need right out of the box, because that has consequences. And it's very easy, even with a out-of-the-box, very fast and lightweight and high-scoring theme as Hyvä to really mess things up quickly by using these kind of external scripts. So, for example, if we have a little widget somewhere on a page that requires this kind of external JavaScript library, maybe some kind of interactive stock availability or pricing, or maybe a chat widget or something, right? So it's a good idea not to load that initially, but rather to add an event listener like a mouse over event, or maybe a focus event, or on mobile a touch start event, and that then will create that script tag to load the external JavaScript file and initialize it when it's ready. And for example, for a chat widget, it might be possible to create a little fake DOM node, so it's not even a layout shift that occurs, right? And then as soon as the library loads, it replaces the fake widget with the real one. That's actually interactive. So that way we don't influence the Google score, we only load what's needed when it's needed. And yeah, so that works quite well there. Right, so now that I've got a place where I want to put my JavaScript code on the page, now the most common task when converting a Magento code, JavaScript code to Hyvä is a lot of it is jQuery, right? So I have to know how to rewrite the same things that the original author used jQuery for with plain JavaScript. And it turns out that's actually very simple. Nowadays, almost anything that we used to have to use jQuery for can be done right out of the box. The browsers have become a lot smarter. So here's an example from a module where some kind of additional checks were added to the product add to cart action. So in jQuery, it used product, just selected the button and then did some additional checks before it actually submitted the form. So the same thing in Hyvä, just use document get element by ID, add event listener, same thing for submit. So it's actually very close. Quite often I get questions in Slack like, okay, so how do I do this? And then after one or two such questions, people are usually fine, and that's not the hard part. This is actually very straightforward. There are one or two exceptions where it might require a little more work, but there's this nice website, you might not need it, jQuery.com, and in there you can search for jQuery functions, and they'll show you the code, how the same thing looks in vanilla JavaScript. Very straightforward. So I've used this I think I've used it once only for something that I actually needed. But in case you run into some, if jQuery is heavily used and you just, some weird selector combinations that aren't supported out of the box or something, well, this website probably has you covered. Now, another thing that is used a lot in Magento, and most people use jQuery Ajax for that, is calls to REST API endpoints or GraphQL API endpoints. And in Hyvä we use the browser native fetch method for that. It takes a little getting used to coming from jQuery, but it actually works great. So that's what we use there. Not a lot to say, it's all promise based, very straightforward, actually not that different from how it works with jQuery. Just something to get used for. It's, similar, not the same. Usually it's quite straightforward to map it from one to the other. We have a lot of examples in the documentation how to, let me just pull that up maybe. So in the docs, using fetch. So, here we have examples for simple get request, using accept header, simple post, how do we emulate an Ajax request, a form post example, GraphQL post, GraphQL get. Okay, so you can take this code and adjust it for your own needs as required. So yeah, that shouldn't be a big problem. Now you might have seen here this little method, Hyvä get form key. There actually are a handful of such methods. So Hyvä is a global object on the window object, so it's always available. And there's not a lot on it, but what is on there is very commonly used. So we have methods to set the cookie, get a cookie, get the browser storage. So usually that would be local storage, except for the odd mobile Safari. Post form, get form key, formatting a price. So that's what's in there. Very straightforward. Not a big thing. Good to know it's there. Right. Now, this brings us to the next section, which is customer section data or private content data. It's different names. Anybody who's written Magento 2 front-end code will be familiar with it. In Luma, we have this big complex system as part of the front-end architecture where we have a mapping from specific endpoints in Magento, like action paths, URL paths, and if a get or if a post or delete action is sent to one of these endpoints, and there can be wildcards in there, these sections will automatically be invalidated or automatically reloaded depending on whether it's AJAX or post and so on. So there's a lot going on there, and it turns out though that having to deal with all these different sections being individually invalidated and reloaded, quite often I've seen modules that used a lot of code to synchronize that stuff, and it actually causes a lot of overhead. It's quite astonishing. So in Hyvä we got rid of most of that. Instead, what happens is we have a single request to the sections endpoint and load all the sections at once. And once they're loaded, on every page, an event is dispatched containing all the data, and any part on the front end that needs access to the customer section data just observes that event, private content loaded, and then can pick out whatever data it needs, be it one section or multiple sections. And we don't have any path-based invalidation. So if a post is sent, that invalidates the private content version, so it will be reloaded, or it times out after an hour, so then also it will be reloaded. In the meantime, it will be stored in local storage, just like in Luma. So only after these two things it will be reloaded. Otherwise, when the initial page is loaded, the existing data will be dispatched to all the observers, or we can also dispatch a custom event, reload customer section data. That could be useful, for example, after sending a post request or something, maybe adding a product to the cart or something, then it will also be rebroadcast. If I really want to force a reload immediately without sending a post request first, this is how we would do it. We would invalidate the mage cache session ID cookie and then dispatch the reload customer section data event. And then Hyvä will reload the data and dispatch it to all the components. And this actually reduces a lot of complexity in the modules and works pretty nicely. I was surprised that it actually does work this well. Okay, there's a lot more, to be honest, mainly in the details. I don't want to go into too much detail here. Like, for example, at one point I was using an Alpine to either show or hide parts of the DOM depending on, should something be rendered in list view or grid view, and I had a couple of hundred nodes, and each of the nodes, then all of a sudden Google Page Speed was giving me excessive DOM size warnings. And a solution there is to use the Alpine Js template tag to exclude parts of the DOM. It'll be completely ignored. Google will ignore it, and it won't actually cause that problem anymore for the core web metrics. Another possible issue is using many xref tags. That's an easy way to reference a specific DOM node with an Alpine Js view model. It's very quick and easy to use, but if I use them very much in a component, like hundreds of references to DOM nodes, things can become a bit sluggish. So then it's actually faster to use document query selector instead. So little things like this come up over time. As always, not every system is optimized for every use case, so that's just things to learn. And then it's also really helpful to ask about it in Slack, because probably somebody already has found solutions how to deal with this. So that's all about JavaScript. That was the biggest part of this presentation here, but there's a little more. Let's have a look at the style side of things. So basically, we want to replace all the Luma styles. So this was the compare products link. In Luma, we have things like compare, wrapper, item link, compare, action, compare, no display, whatever. In Hyvä, we have things like flex, item center, order 3, compare link, relative, invisible, inline block, no underline, and viewport size selectors. It takes a bit getting used to. It doesn't look very nice, but it's actually super easy to write. And the big benefit of using this utility class framework, a framework like this, like in Tailwind, is that because the same classes are reused again and again and again on every page, the CSS file that gets generated, actually at one point it starts peaking and it doesn't grow anymore, even if new pages are added, because it's just the same classes being reused in different combinations. Whereas on a site where we have semantical names, like item link compare specific to compare products, it's used nowhere else. So their styles tend to grow over time, CSS files. So there it just grows and grows and grows, and it becomes quite large, as we can see in Luma. So Tailwind is a mobile first CSS framework, and I mainly worked as a backend developer the last couple of years. So it took me a bit of getting used to know how to work with this. So there's a configuration file called Tailwind config.js, and in there we can configure these kind of breakpoints and selectors, like small, medium, large, extra large, 2XL, and they translate to media queries that are used in the CSS styles, and then I can prefix these kind of classes like margin left 3. If I prefix that with an SM tag, for example, small, that would mean it would be placed within a media query in the generated CSS that would match it to any 640 pixel wide or wider screen. So what we generally start with is we start with all the styles that should apply only to the small or mobile version of a page, and then add the exceptions for the larger styles. And after a bit of getting used to, again, works very well. So specify mobile as default, override for the larger viewports. So that's quite handy. We can reorder columns maybe to a different location on the page, add different margins, center stuff, etc. It's very handy. One thing that I really would recommend anybody starting out with Hyvä is learn the Tailwind Flex related classes. Flexbox is used a lot and it's super handy. So a lot of the things that I usually try to do is I end up using Flexbox. There's also a bit use of CSS grids, but not as much as Flexbox. In general, I find anything can be solved with either approach, but knowing Flexbox helps a lot with Tailwind, and it's actually really easy. They added a really nice abstraction over standard CSS, just inline CSS, with these Flex container related classes there. So that makes working and styling things really quick and fast. Right. Now back to writing compatibility modules. If we have a module and that declares some external additional less files that should be loaded only on specific pages, for example, in Hyvä we generally remove those. So those would be a remove statement in a compatibility module layout XML, and then we would style them directly in line with Tailwind classes, just like anything else. What the point here being, we don't use external CSS classes besides the one style CSS file that is generated for a Hyvä theme. Okay, and there's also again the case for some libraries that come with things like SDKs. So there's some CSS that isn't actually Magento specific. It's maybe part of some integration, right? And we can also use those, of course, but be careful again. So if it's something that used within the critical rendering path, it might actually still be a better idea to replace it with inline Tailwind CSS. But if it's not used as part of the critical rendering path, or maybe it's only used on a page where I don't really care, right? Then it's fine just to use the CSS file as is. But we can also use the same trick as with the JavaScript file in this case. So only if somebody starts scrolling, if something becomes visible, or if the user interacts in some way, we can just load this JavaScript dynamically, because that way it doesn't negatively impact our performance scores for our site. Right. So we can, of course, use CSS, but yeah, in some cases we just have to be careful. So yeah, it really depends. There's a very nice tool for this, for converting these styles, and that's the Windy browser plugin by Beyond Code. It's really nice. So it's a commercial product. It costs not that much. It's like 50 euros, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So, and the way it works is you activate this little module, this little browser plugin, like right here, and then hover over, hey, oh, maybe it's deactivated for this specific page. Well, let me just try it on here. So I'll click here. Okay, and now I can hover over a part of the DOM, and it will automatically, if I now click, it'll copy that section of the DOM, but it will have replaced all the traditional CSS and will automatically have replaced it with the Tailwind CSS classes that match the original CSS, right? So that makes it super fast as an inexperienced developer to create a layout that looks like the original module, only using Tailwind classes. And I can just use Shift click to copy only the Tailwind classes, or I can copy the whole DOM, including the markup, by just clicking without Shift. And if there are some missing styles, like here there's a max width 990 pixels, I can configure it to copy that as a inline style tag. So this actually makes it super fast to make this kind of conversions. It doesn't get me there 100%. Most of the time there are too many Tailwind classes in it, like maybe it's specifying a font size or a font color, and I don't really have to do that on that element because it's already the default, or specifies further down at the root of the page. So in the DOM. So I usually just copy that, remove 2/3 of the tags it generates, but it's still very handy. And I use it less and less nowadays because I've become more familiar with Tailwind CSS, but that's been really handy. It's a nice investment. All right, so we're getting towards the end, but there's still one more thing I want to mention. And that is view helpers. Now, view helpers are PHP, so no JavaScript. And or view models, sorry. So PHP view models are kind of like the modern version of the Magento view helpers that we instantiate with this helper in a template. Only that view models usually are injected using layout XML. Now, because that again requires layout XML to specify a block argument with a class name of the view model, that became very cumbersome. So instead, what we do in Hyvä a lot is we use a class that is automatically assigned to every template, which is the view model registry. So in every template, we can use the variable $viewModels and call require on it, which will return an instance of the given view model. So it's kind of like this helper method, except that these view models are they have to implement the block argument interface just like any view model in Magento. So view models themselves were actually, the core uses them too, but haven't been around for too long, so they're only used very sparingly. So anyway, that's what we use in Hyvä mostly instead of blocks. So we don't create custom blocks, and we encourage people just to use the standard template block, and any logic that's required to load data or interact with with the PHP layer, we add this as view models. And this leads to very nicely encapsulated templates that can be used anywhere on a page without having to be, without a lot of layout XML that needs to be adjusted along the way. And they can be quite simple, like here we have a current product view model, we just call get on it and we get the current product on a product page, for example. Or they can be more complex, like we have a modal view model where we require it, and then there's kind of a fluent interface, we can say create modal with template. There's some additional configurations that we can do, like if we want an overlay or not, and where it should be located on the page, maybe some labels, and then we can show that using, and render it just by echoing out this instance here of the view model. So we use these PHP view models a lot in Hyvä. All right, so that was it. Thank you very much. I would be delighted if you had some questions or comments. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question. Actually, two more questions about the view model registry that you have presented in the previous slide. Don't you think that this looks a bit like a step backward in the way of Magento 1 style, when we all use Magento core, give me this model, and so on and so on, instead of pure using of view models by specifying them in layout XML.
Yeah, I can relate. I had the same concerns. Turns out, so far, I haven't seen any negative effects. So one thing is if I want to configure them in layout XML, it's just more work, right? And it's really causes a lot of busy work. And I haven't seen any benefits of it, like being able to override them in layout XML. I guess that would be the proposed benefit there, right? That we can just create a new module that overrides which class is used as the view model. I've never really seen that used. And we still can use plugins on them, right? So that's not a downside. And there are some additional benefits that comes with this approach. For example, in Hyvä it's possible to implement the identity interface on view models. So if that happens and the view model has a getIdentities method, then these cache tags that are returned by the getIdentities method will automatically add it to the list of cache tags for the page. So we don't have to implement a custom block class, for example. That's not possible in Luma. That's something Hyvä specific thanks to this view model registry. So yeah, it works actually very well, is all I can say. And I have to admit that some of the concepts that were used in Magento 1 actually were pretty smart. And not everything in Magento 2 was a step forward. Some things definitely were. So I'm a big fan of DI and the object manager configuration and other things. But this is actually really nice and turns out to make the nice addition. For example, what happens because of this is that templates actually turn into kind of UI components in a good way. So a template is like one encapsulated thing that I can take from somewhere and put it on a page somewhere and it just works. And that's kind of nice. So it's less coupled to different parts of the system, specific block class or layout XML. No, it makes it actually very reusable and swappable, and that's not a bad thing.
Don't you think that this case when a lot of logic is concentrated in the HTML, will make it a bit more difficult to maintain and to extend, to reuse it anyway.
Yep, good question. Valid concern. All I can say is that if you look at Luma templates, there's a lot of logic in there too. So it doesn't really lead to an increase in business logic. And the logic themselves is still actually in the PHP classes. So it's not really in the templates, it's just the methods that get called, right? So there is that. And as we are really we're working with a mindset of not introducing backward incompatible changes to the view models. So the idea is that if I'm writing a template and I'm using one of the view models, it'll just work. And I'm not required to use a block, because blocks would traditionally, the block would contain a lot of methods specific to one template, right? So a template and a block were very coupled. And now it's more like, well, in the template I have this composition of different view models, and each view model is generic, and I kind of use these generic view models from within the template. Instead of having one specific PHP class, the block that's very specific to one specific PHP template, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, that's also a nice approach, and it would be interesting to apply to run some code on it.
Yeah. I would be curious to hear your...
One more question, the last, basically, about the JavaScript code. If I understood you right, you told that there were that all the basic JavaScript code will be concentrated in HTML files instead of former JS components. Don't you think that it would make those HTML files larger, more difficult, less reusable, and it would have a issue that the developer couldn't structurize his JavaScript code in the way it would be more clear and more understandable, and for example, like a pure example of it, it's Magento to check out JavaScript. Yes, of course, there are a very large number of different JS files, but this way of structurizing it into some actions, models, views, it looks like a nice approach to structurize the code instead of pulling in just one or a few HTML files. What do you think about such consequences?
Yeah. That's an excellent question there. Right. So first of all, the checkout actually isn't part of Hyvä. There are different alternatives that can be used. So for one, it's still possible to use the Luma checkout as a fallback for Hyvä. That's what most stores actually do. But any Hyvä checkout can be used, like one-step checkout can be used, then also there's things like in context checkouts like Bolt that can be used with Hyvä, that's compatible already. And then there's a React checkout that's usable with Hyvä. And we're also building another checkout now, which is a Laravel Livewire port for Magento MageWire checkout. So checkout is the most complex part, and that's something different. So for most pages that aren't the checkout, right, not that much JavaScript is needed. After converting the Magento JavaScript to Hyvä, I actually usually end up with maybe a third to half as much JavaScript just by line count compared to the amount of code that was necessary in Magento. And in regards to maintainability, I find having a lot of small JavaScript files all over the place is actually often not very easy to understand and to work with, and it's normally a lot easier if I have one file and everything's there, so it's like one component. It's kind of like a React component, right? I have the HTML, I have the JavaScript that interacts with it, and it's in the same place, so a lot less context switching is necessary there. Regarding reusability, that's another good point. It's still possible to use JavaScript like a view model, declare it in one file, and then include a few nested files that refer to the other JavaScript there. So it's not always necessary to put everything in one file. Most of the time we do that because it just makes sense, but it is not always necessary. And finally, I just would like to add that we do this for a reason, right? We don't just do it to be different. We do it because we want to have a theme that scores really well out of the box, and not even just out of the box. It also is possible to create a custom theme that scores really well with with Google, whatever you choose, be it Core Web Vitals, be it Lighthouse, whatever. So that's where the main benefit is. So if it were possible to use the Luma approach and still have a acceptable score, sure, no problem. I wouldn't mind. I have been working with that approach for a long time, and to be honest, it's kind of fun writing JavaScript code with require.js and such. But it just doesn't deliver, right? So it's a showstopper for except that people just kind of resign into, oh yeah, it's just how it is. It shouldn't be that way, right? So there's a good reason not to use that approach. Yeah.
I understand your concerns. Thank you for such well-explained questions.
I would like to show you examples, but to be honest, my mind's kind of blank right now. I can't I can't think of anything right now. So if you're in Slack, ask me again. I'm sure at a different time I'll be able to pull up nice examples out of Hyvä and show them instead.
I suppose it's better to have your mind clean than mind Luma. Talking about Magento-2. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for your questions.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any questions or comments? If you want, you can also type them and I'll read them.
Janek, if you're still around, is there anything you would like to add in regards to your experiences working with Hyvä? It could be something that follows what I say, or something to the contrary. I would be happy to hear that too. And
Yeah, actually, pretty much most of the things I already knew and that have some practical experience. And also, when usually people projects go to Hyvä, they are not like started with Hyvä, but usually already existing projects go to Hyvä. So not only third-party modules have to be like compatible with Hyvä, but also the modules that were created for specific project should also maintain or have that Hyvä compatibility. And what I have done is actually extended those modules and added GraphQL like interface to them. And it was quite easy to fetch information. For example, if you need something on PDP or something else, it's quite easy to use that GraphQL features and then have just the Alpine Js templates, and that's it.
Yeah, good point.
I'll let that direction.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's not just the external third-party vendor modules, it's also the project-specific modules that often need converting, and that's work that always needs to be done. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, we use GraphQL a lot.
And that, I didn't have to rewrite everything or something. I just added the GraphQL and I got the information, and that's pretty much like 90% it was enough.
Yeah, cool. Very good. Thanks for sharing.
I have one question about the GitLab you showed before. Is that available, like in read-only mode?
The Compat module tracker, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. That's public actually. It's only license holders can add issues, but anybody can read it. Let me paste that in the chat here.
That would be great, yeah.
There it is.
It'd be interesting
Oh,
to
sorry,
see
there was
how many-
private message. Let me send it so everybody can see it. Yeah, right there. So again, not everything that's being worked on is in there, and not everything is 100% up to date, but it's not bad either, right? So if I get the information something isn't up to date or is already published and it's not listed as published here, or somebody's working on something, I try to keep this as up to date as possible. And also, let me just pick a random one here. Right, so here's a nice example actually. Usually we ask people to add all the features that a module has in Luma.
You don't have your screen.
Oh, sorry, yeah. There we go. That's better. So this was one of the random issues here that I chose, one in progress. So somebody's working on that, not me. And so we have a issue template here, which is called module request template. So if somebody is creating an entry here, it's a good idea to use this issue template, because then it has this basic structure in place right here, module request, like this. And so the idea here is that we get an overview over which parts of a module already work with Hyvä and which parts don't yet work with Hyvä, right? And there's a little bit of additional information here. So yeah, that's quite handy. And again, not everybody takes the time to perfectly maintain this, but it's probably enough to give you an idea of how the state of where something is. And it's growing all the time, so I'm really happy with it. Also that extension vendors are starting to pick up their own modules. Smaller extension vendors have been quicker, which was great. Obviously for them it's not such a big investment, but larger extension vendors have now actually started expressing interest in becoming tech partners and supporting at least their most important extensions, like their best-selling extension and stuff. So that's super valuable, and we appreciate that a lot. And we're really interested in also helping people who want to convert create compatibility modules, because I think extensions are a super important part of the Magento ecosystem, right? So it's good to have a good answer for this, yeah.
Another question, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
You said that one-page checkout has been integrated with Hyvä.
Yeah.
I assume they're not using this LiveWire or this port?
No, that LiveWire port actually isn't yet available. We announced that at Reacticon. We have an employee, Willem Portman. He's working on it full time, so it's growing, but that one's not there yet.
So on Alpine Js in this case.
Well, it will be, yeah.
No, I don't mean the language.
Well, there will it will also work with Luma, to be honest, the LiveWire checkout. So we'll have a product, it'll become a product, and it will work with Hyvä or Luma. So because some people then want to maybe create an integration or customization, and that should work with both versions of the site. Yeah, all of the Luma checkouts work with Hyvä, because we have an extension called Luma Fallback. And that allows to configure a user to configure different routes for which Luma should be used, or actually any theme. You configure a theme. So in those cases, you would create a custom child theme of Luma and only style the checkout page in it, and then configure the checkout page as the fallback, and then it would be Hyvä for everything except for the checkout, where then the Luma checkout would be used. And that's how one-page checkout and actually any of the other checkouts that work with that work with Luma also can be used with Hyvä.
Is that very time consuming to have to need to also style the checkout with Luma in addition to Hyvä? It's just like the content that has to be styled.
All I can say is that it's usually only compared to styling a whole site, it's a very small subset that needs to be done for the checkout. And again, that then depends on how familiar somebody is with styling a Magento theme, a Luma theme. Somebody who's familiar with it, I would say it's not a lot of work at all. It also depends on how happy somebody is with the default look and feel, right? So far, seems to be okay or good. And yeah, at one point in time, pretty soon we'll have a option that works with Tailwind and with a Livewire checkout. I've also spoken to people who use the style sheet that was generated for the Hyvä page, right? So we run a build and that generates a style CSS file that gets loaded, right? And that contains all the styles for the whole site. And some people also include that in the Luma checkout. And then they need to apply some additional fixes though, because Tailwind has some reset styles first, right? So they have to be adjusted in a way to get that working. I haven't done that myself, but I know that people did that too, to avoid having to recreate a lot of content. And that way they could use Tailwind in a Luma checkout even.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so many different ways to go there. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's one more thing I wanted to show in regards to Compat modules actually, and that is we have a lot of documentation. So we have the whole writing code stuff that's generally just about writing Luma stuff, but then here we have a whole section on writing compatibility modules too, right? So how to get ready, automatic template override, how to, because many people ask themselves, how do I even start? Now I have this module, what do I do first, right? So I really try to, where to begin coding, different stuff here, converting CSS. So lots of documentation on it, also on the Luma theme fallback, page-specific content. Yeah, lots of code, lots of documentation in there on how to do specific things in Hyvä, different common patterns that are used when building Hyvä stuff and so on. Yeah.
So, as a conclusion, we can say it's much easier to start with Hyvä than with Magento 1 in 2008.
Oh, yes. I would think so. Really. In general, I'm really surprised. I've heard this again and again and again. That even on the initial Hyvä project, less time is needed compared to a Luma project. Even with a team that's very familiar with Luma and doing a first-time Hyvä project, it's a lot quicker. So yeah, it's actually a lot easier. Plus, we have the dedicated support chat, so we have our own little community there. Any license holder has access to Slack, and yeah, we read every message and try to be available and responsive there too. So, and people help, themselves. It's not just us; other people answer as well, and so on. So yeah, it's good to take advantage of that.
Amazing, yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. If there's no additional questions or comments, let's say call it a meetup. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. And yeah, feel free to reach out if something else comes up. Here's Twitter or wherever.